Hi folks, welcome back. Today I want to talk to you about mouthpieces, the most overlooked part of a pipe. Everybody focuses on the bowl, but not a whole lot of people focus on the thing that you are in contact with the most throughout your smoking experience. And so today I'm going to talk to you about the materials used, the construction of the mouthpiece, and all of the things that impact the comfort of the mouthpiece as you use it. So as I said, the mouthpiece is often overlooked. It's like a secondary piece, an add-on. Oftentimes I'll get calls from people asking me if I'll just do a replacement mouthpiece because it's got to be really easy. Well, it's not. It's maybe a quarter to a third the total amount of time that it takes to make a pipe. A mouthpiece, a well-made mouthpiece, takes a long time to make. Now there's a big difference between a handmade mouthpiece and a mouthpiece that is preformed or done in a factory. They're very different things, and each of them requires a different skill set to make. So the misconception or the underappreciation of the mouthpiece reminds me of the handle of a knife. It's the thing that's often overlooked because you want to focus on the blade. It's the thing that does the cutting after all. But if it's not for a comfortable handle, a well-balanced knife that fits well in your hand, it will be unwieldy to use. Well, similarly with a pipe, an uncomfortable mouthpiece will not make the pipe usable for you. You won't find yourself drawn to it to pick up. And the reason is that it's the point of connection to the user. There's a massive difference between a really well-made mouthpiece and a really poorly made mouthpiece. And I want to talk to you about all of the things that go into making a good mouthpiece. So today I'm going to break this down into three categories. First, we're going to talk about materials. Second, we're going to talk about the way it's made or the construction. And third, we're going to talk about all of the things that impact the comfort of the mouthpiece as you use it. So the materials that are made. Generally speaking, there are two categories of materials. Now, I'm not going to talk about the more exotic materials like horn or amber because they're very rare. Most of you won't get your hands on them, and they're really intended for decorative use more than they are for usability or durability. The two materials that are commonly used in making mouthpieces for pipes are acrylics and ebonite or vulcanite. Now, acrylics are all of those materials that are plastics, things like lucite or bakelite. So there are three things that I look for in a material to make a pipe mouthpiece. The first is it durable. Second, is it beautiful? And the third, is it comfortable? So let's talk about the first category, acrylic. Acrylic is a broad category for plastics, things like lucite or bakelite that we typically see in pipe mouthpieces. It's probably the most common material that you've seen in a pipe mouthpiece around the world. It's used in everything from basket pipes all the way up through custom handmade pipes. It is a material that has some pros and cons just like any other. Now in the pro category, we have the fact that it's relatively inexpensive to purchase. Now there are exceptions to that, of course, if you get very rare specialty materials. Things like bakelite are typically harder to find. They're available in some really unique colors and it has some unique characteristics as opposed to lucite. But the material is difficult to source and it's quite expensive when you can find it. But generally speaking, acrylics are inexpensive. You can find them in a variety of suppliers. It's available in a variety of colors and patterns. It's a really beautiful material and a lot of people really enjoy it for that reason. Secondly, acrylics are also relatively easy to work with for the pipe maker. It finishes extremely easily, it's beautiful when it's finished, and it maintains that shine for a very long time, essentially forever unless you take sandpaper to it. Now let's talk about the cons. The first is that it's a more brittle material than ebonite. It is very hard, and that's why it can stay shiny so long, but as a result, it makes it so that it's more susceptible to cracking or breaking between your teeth, which means in order for a pipe maker to make a mouthpiece that's going to last a long time, they make them a little bit thicker than they might in another material. The other thing is that the pipe is more likely to suffer damage or breakage if dropped because the mouthpiece will likely break. One of the weak points when you make a lucite mouthpiece is the tenon, so most people will use a non-integral tenon, something like Teflon or Delrin, that is tougher and more flexible as a insert into the mouthpiece for the tenon. Now, that helps prevent the problem of breakage, but what it also introduces is another point of separation. Now, when I make my pipes, I try to make them as simple as possible in terms of construction. I want to have as few glue joints as is possible, because each one of those glue joints is a potential point of failure for my clients, and I try to not have my pipes fail. So I moved away a number of years ago from Delrin tenons for that reason. I didn't like having my Delrin tenons pulled out of the mouthpiece, and that's one of the reasons why I don't personally use acrylic. One of the other cons about acrylic, and this is maybe more particular to me, is that I find it really uncomfortable. And the reason is that because it's thicker typically to make a safe mouthpiece, one that won't break, it ends up being larger between your teeth, and it also doesn't have any give to it. So it's quite literally, you're holding a piece of plastic between your teeth. I don't find that comfortable. Many of you like to put softy bits on your mouthpieces, and it makes it more squishy and more comfortable, and that's fine. That's a way to work around it. But generally speaking, I don't care for acrylic for that reason. Now let's move on to ebonite, the other material. Ebonite, or vulcanite, is a vulcanized rubber material, and it's the same thing essentially that a bowling ball is made out of, or the tires on your car, although a lot harder. We pipe makers get this in a long extruded piece of solid material like this, and we cut them off in lengths and make the mouthpieces out of them. Ebonite is available in a number of grades from hard to soft, and I typically buy the hardest grade with that. And the reason is, the harder it is, the less the sulfur content, and it's the sulfur content that causes the material to oxidize. We all know, if we've ever owned an ebonite mouthpiece pipe, that ebonite likes to oxidize, especially if exposed to UV rays. Well, the more sulfur that's in it, or the softer the mouthpiece is, the more likely it is to oxidize more quickly. Now, there's a difference between the extruded meter of ebonite that I showed you and the type of vulcanite that is used for formed or molded mouthpieces. And the reason is that in order for it to go through the molding process, it has to be a little softer, it has to have a higher sulfur content. And the material is, in my opinion, and in many others, it is an inferior material. It tends to oxidize more quickly than handmade mouthpieces, and it tends to be a little less comfortable due to some other additives, I would imagine. Another kind of vulcanite material is called brindle or Cumberland, and many of you have seen this before. It's basically a colored vulcanite. It has a couple different colors that are put in a pattern, and it's like brick and black. It's beautiful. I love the material, don't use it very often, but I find it extremely beautiful. And you can also find vulcanite in a lot of other colors, but they tend to be less bright and vivacious as the colors you might see from acrylics. Let's talk about the pros of ebonite. The first is that it's more durable, and part of that durability comes from the flexibility inherent in the material. It is more flexible than acrylic, and that means it's less susceptible to breaking than acrylic might be. The other thing is that that flexibility means it's a little more comfortable between your teeth, something that I prefer. So the cons of ebonite. Well, the first is that it's very expensive. If you look at a meter of standard acrylic, it can be had for a few dollars, or maybe $10. But a meter of ebonite of the same width might cost you $50 or $100. Ebonite is extremely expensive when compared to acrylic. The other thing is that it's more difficult to work with. For pipe makers, we have to sharpen our tools more often. I'm thinking it's because of the sulfur content is abrasive on the edges that we have. I can use one tool bit on many acrylic mouthpieces in a row, and it won't be dull at all, but I have to sharpen my tools halfway through making a mouthpiece out of ebonite. And the final reason is that it oxidizes. Yeah, it takes some TLC. You gotta maintain them. You can't leave them in the sun. It's a little finicky when compared to acrylic, which you can just leave out anywhere. And that's part of why I like it. I like playing with things. So for some people it might be a con, for me it's a pro. So now let's move on to talking about the design and construction of the mouthpiece. And this is really important because it not only affects the way that you feel about the pipe when you look at it, but it also affects the way that it feels when you're using it. In considering the design of the mouthpiece, like any part of a pipe, it's a marriage between form and function. It has to work properly, but it also has to look good. The mouthpiece should be pretty to look at, should be harmonious with the overall design of the pipe, and it should also function properly. In terms of the finishing of the mouthpiece, it should be finished well. It should have no ripples or scratches on it. And its proportions should be good for the pipe. It shouldn't be too long or too short or too wide or too tall. You will have your own preferences for this, but the more pipes that you see, the better an eye you develop for what you like, what you think is harmonious overall in terms of the design. The next thing is whether you want a saddle mouthpiece or a taper mouthpiece. Those are the two general categories. The saddle mouthpiece is going to be thinner between your teeth and between your lips, and a tapered mouthpiece is going to be thicker. They have different appearances overall, but each of them has its own place in pipe design history and also in the aesthetic vocabulary of pipe design. And finally, there's the matter of decorations. Do you like decorative materials on your mouthpieces? I tend to prefer simple designs. I don't like there to be too many embellishments on a mouthpiece or on the shank. If there's an embellishment on the shank, I don't want to see one on the mouthpiece, and vice versa. And the reason is that I think that one decoration usually is enough for a pipe. You don't want to overwhelm the design with too many pieces of jewelry. Now let's move on to the internal design of the mouthpiece. And this is really the critical point. The most beautiful mouthpiece in the world that is drilled improperly will not smoke properly. But an ugly mouthpiece that is drilled well will at least perform as it ought to. One of the key features that I look for in the design of a mouthpiece is that the airway diameter in the mouthpiece is the same as the airway diameter in the shank. I also want to see those two line up exactly or very nearly exactly in the bottom of the mortise to help the airflow be as uninterrupted as possible. The other thing that you ought to see is the volume of air should be consistent throughout the mouthpiece, so as the mouthpiece flattens toward the button end so that it can be comfortable between your teeth, that the airway is funneled out and widens toward the button. And that allows the volume of airflow to be as consistent as possible throughout to prevent any kind of turbulence or any compression of the air as it's passing through. The other thing, and this is both a finishing and a practical thing, is that I don't want to see any rough edges on the internals of the mouthpiece. There should be no cavities or major scratches on the inside. And the reason is each of those things can collect gunk from smoking, and that can create off flavors. The other thing is that any kind of cavity can catch the end of your pipe cleaner as you're trying to pass it through, and your customer, or the pipe you're buying if you're using it, might not pass a pipe cleaner every time, and that's a problem. It shouldn't be. Another feature is that I like to see the end of the tenon chamfered. I think it looks better, but it also breaks that edge, the 90-degree edge on the end of the tenon that would otherwise be there. That edge can cause not only turbulence in the airflow, but also can cause there to be whistling if you blow through the mouthpiece, and no one likes that. And finally, the mouthpiece ought to pass an extra fluffy pipe cleaner from front to back and back to front with as little resistance as possible. So now that we've discussed the materials and the internal and external design of the mouthpiece, it comes down to the last thing, comfort. How does the mouthpiece feel to you? Is it comfortable between your teeth, between your lips? If you don't have a comfortable mouthpiece, you're not going to use the pipe. Now, people have all sorts of preferences here. Some people like thick mouthpieces, some people like thin ones, some people like wide or narrow, some people like some materials over the other. It's all about personal preference. Some people even buy really expensive, very carefully made, extremely thin mouthpieces only to put a softy bit on it. And that's their preference, and that's okay. I thought I would leave you today with my general rules for mouthpiece design. So my first general rule is that thinner is better than thicker. Of course, not too thin, you don't want it to be breakable, and not too thick. Generally speaking, I like my mouthpieces to be about 4 millimeters thick behind the button, or under 150 thousandths of an inch. That makes it thick enough to be strong, but thin enough to be comfortable. My second rule is that I use a medium width mouthpiece for just about everything. The exceptions to that are, of course, extremely small or extremely large pipes, or if a customer has a specific preference, I can make it to their liking. And for me, a medium width is about 16 millimeters wide, or 650 thousandths or so. My third rule is that saddle bits are better than tapered bits. Now that's my preference. I prefer the comfort of a saddle mouthpiece to a tapered mouthpiece. A lot of people like tapered mouthpieces, and that's totally fine. But for me, if you look at the history of my pipes, I would say 90% plus of them have all been saddle mouthpieces. And the final rule, and this one's going to be controversial, is that ebonite is better than acrylic. I know, for all of you acrylic mouthpiece lovers, I am anathema. However, I prefer ebonite. The reason is I prefer durability and flexibility to appearance. So that's it. That's what I've got for you today. Hopefully I've answered some of your burning questions about mouthpieces, and if you have any that I didn't address or would like to ask further, please ask them below in the comments. If you've got any suggestions for future videos as well, I would love to hear them. Send me a message or drop them in the comments below, and I will do my very best to get to them. I want to thank you all for tuning into this video. I really do hope you enjoyed it. And again, as always, happy puffing.